Kim Jong-un's erratic behavior is becoming increasingly problematic for China, but what are the relations between North Korea and China? China has been one of North Korea's long-standing allies, trading partners and source of food and energy since the country's creation post-WWII. Historically, it has also been an opponent of any sanctions coming from the international community and the United Nations. In February 2014, China openly criticized a UN report which outlined the human rights abuse in North Korea, involving torture, forced starvation and crimes against humanity. But it is likely China has done so not out of altruistic reasons, but to avoid a regime collapse and influx of refugees. Bethany Allen Abrahamian, an assistant editor at Foreign Policy, said China is always careful in its handling of the North Korean situation. China fears that harsher sanctions may destabilize its northern neighbor, which could potentially send millions of refugees over the border, she said. But recent missile tests, and growing international pressure, have only narrowed Beijing's options. Korea's and China's history were intertwined for a period of time in the early 20th century when a Japanese occupation swept through the region. This gave rise to various Marxist groups and guerrilla fighters who would later dominate the region. When Japan left the Korean peninsula in August of 1945, the USSR installed a communist government in the north with Kim Il-sung as its leader, handpicked by Joseph Stalin himself. Then in 1950 tensions escalated when the North invaded the South with military backing from China. Today the situation is much more complex, however, and China, who is no longer a pure Maoist state, is growing increasingly concerned with Kim Jong-un's actions. The seemingly steadfast relationship was challenged in 2006 when Pyongyang tested a nuclear device in October. In an unprecedented move, Beijing supported a UN Security Council resolution which imposed sanctions on North Korea. The strained relationship took another dive this year when Chinese President Xi Jinping halted all imports of coal from North Korea, the country's main source of income. Reportedly, some 2 million tons of coal were left stranded in Chinese ports as North Korean vessels were turned away. Nearly two-thirds of North Korea's trade is tied to China, which gives Beijing leverage over the isolated state. He told CNBC, "We're seeing some incremental steps that the Chinese may be in favor of doing more. I think China is signaling to both sides, to the US, that China is doing more, that China is acting in good faith to head off a crisis in North Korea. Primarily they're telling the US that ultimately China feels the only solution in North Korea is one that involves diplomacy and getting North Korea to the table. It is likely China will continue to put pressure on and try to rein in its troublesome neighbor, but at the same time avoid conflict." The presence of the US military and President Donald Trump's unpredictable behavior has only made the tension in the Korean peninsula more palpable. North Korea's nuclear program is becoming increasingly problematic, but as long as China prevents Kim Jong-un from pulling the war trigger, it can be considered North Korea's strongest ally.